Hey everyone, welcome to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with Brad Stulberg. Brad, welcome.
Dan, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. I'm sure we're going to go all over the place related to performance. But let's start where we always do. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I wear a couple of hats in my day-to-day life. The first and foremost hat is a husband and father. I've got two young kids. The second hat is as an author. I write books exploring excellence, health, mastery, performance, all the things that we share in common. And the other hat that I wear is as a coach, where in my coaching practice, I work with individuals on their mental skills and capabilities. And in my coaching practice, it is a handful of entrepreneurs, a handful of physicians, a handful of executives, and a couple athletes. So it's a really nice mix of diverse pursuits. And the last hat that I wear is I'm on faculty at University of Michigan School of Public Health, where, of course, I'm much less interested in the absence of disease and more interested in how we can flourish in our personal and professional lives.
How did all this start, Brad? This is the Sports Psych Show, so we tend to focus on sport, but you take quite a holistic approach to coaching in life, and you coach people from all areas of life, not just sport. So, how did this all start? Just out of interest, were you a competitor in sport at all?
I think it depends on how you define competitor. I was certainly not a world class athlete, far from it. But growing up, I was very competitive in sport all the way through high school. I was the captain of the American varsity football team in my high school. I played basketball at a pretty high level. And it was really only at college that I shifted my focus away from sport and more into academics.
And when you reflect back on those sporting times and you think about what you know now, what you've written about now, what you consult on now, when you reflect back, what do you make of the mental side of your game back then?
I think that, well, this is such a thought provoking question. I'm going to start with the people that coached me because I think as a young athlete in particular, you're so adept and molded by your coaches. And I can look back and say that I had certain coaches who were just wonderful as mentors, as leaders, is doing the right thing, while at the same time, and especially at the high school varsity level, also really trying to win and compete for state championships. And I also had coaches who are just absolutely terrible. So if I knew what I knew now, I wish I could go back, and I'm sure they wouldn't like this high school smartass correcting them. But I wish that I could have told some of these awful coaches, like, you're just going about it the wrong way. Me myself, um, I'd say that I'd give myself about a B.
Okay.
And where I think I excelled as a young athlete was I had so much fun in sport, and I really enjoyed the community aspect of it with my teammates. Um, I think where I fell short is a lot of my competitive drive was probably coming from a place of insecurity.
I'd love to explore that a little bit. Again, with relation to the kind of conversations you have now with your clients. I just want to dig a little bit deeper into bad coaching. When you reflect back, what did that coaching look like, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, it was very much trying to motivate out of a place of fear. So the coach as an authoritarian figure, and any mistake, misstep would be reprimanded, often in front of peers,
Mm.
in a very just immature way, to be quite honest. So the motivation to play well wasn't from a place of wanting to perform well for the coach. It was more wanting to avoid failure because if you failed, you would be embarrassed in front of your teammates.
And do some of those experiences, or have some of those experiences, driven you on towards the place that you're at now, essentially?
It's a good question. I think that the insecurity came not so much from experiences with that particular coach and or a handful, I guess, growing up.
Yeah.
Um, I'd say that it even goes back a little bit farther. So when I was in middle school, well, we're on the sports psych show, so let's go way back to early childhood. Uh, when I was in primary school in second and third grade, I was bullied quite aggressively, to the point where my family switched school districts because I was just getting like really tormented in bullied. Um, I was very fortunate to land in a fourth grade classroom where I quickly made good friends and felt more secure. But then in middle school, I really, really, really wanted to play football, American football, and my parents wouldn't let me. I guess they were a little bit ahead of the time, worried about concussions, this, that, and the other. This is decades ago. Uh, but then when I was in seventh grade, I got jumped on the side of the road. I just got beat up. It was a random event, and it was in my own neighborhood. I was walking my dog, and these two punks pulled over, and they essentially just beat the crap out of me. And that was just terrifying. For a period of time, I was scared to leave my house. I didn't want to walk around the neighborhood alone. The upshot of this is my parents finally said, all right, if you want to play football, you can play football, because they figured it might be good for my confidence. And I went into that weight room not necessarily to become a better football player, but to be strong so I wouldn't get beat up. And so much of my drive for performance was to protect that little kid that got jumped on the side of the road. And that's where the insecurity really came from, that was a big part of my fuel in high school. And what's fascinating, Dan, not to make this a therapy session for me on on your show, but fast forward to today, and I am a power lifter, and I do it at what I would call like a locally competitive level. Maybe I could show up to a regional meet and perform okay in terms of clean athletes in my weight class, but by no means am I making a living doing this, right? Something that I've struggled with is really turning it on for very important lifts, because in the past, when I was a competitive athlete in high school, when it was time to run that 40, or it was time to, try to bench press for a college recruiter, it was my whole identity was on the line because I was so insecure. So whether or not I made the lift, or whether or not I ran the 40 in under 4.65, whatever the number was, it wasn't just about the sport. It was about me. Like if I failed, I was a failure. I was that little kid that got beat up. Whereas now I'm happily married. I've got kids. I've got friends. I've learned to love myself, but I don't have that switch because it's not my whole sense of self that's on the line. And it's very interesting because I write about these things, and I know you think about these things all the time too. It's really a transition from performing from a place of insecurity and maybe some fear or identity foreclosure to performing from a place of love and curiosity and openness. And I just had so much practice and so much rehearsal as a young competitive athlete with the former, that it's been a challenge for me to explore the latter. So it's more than you asked for, but that's really a short history of kind of the shift in motivation as an athlete, and where it came from, and how I grew up as an athlete, and now where I stand today as an athlete.
I think that's fascinating. And listening to what you're saying, it sounds like you're almost trying to tap into that sense of reward rather than thrive from threat. And if you don't mind, I'd love to hone in on that for a few seconds. When you've gone and competed as a powerlifter, who has a sense of multiple identities, who sounds like he's gone through a process of thriving and flourishing in life outside of powerlifting, what kind of tools have you lent on in order to experience that sense of concentration and confidence and control, and I suppose an optimal performance state when you've competed? What have you experimented with?
I find that the most helpful thing for me is the people around me. So if I am at my gym going for a PR and it's a relatively quiet day and it's just kind of me and a coach, I struggle. But if I've got training partners there and we're ribbing each other and giving each other a hard time and amping each other up and kind of going at each other a little bit, those are the days that I just get into the zone and I can really unleash what feels like my best. And there's all these studies, right, of endurance athletes in particular, where they'll put the athlete on an erg, and I think normally they're done on bikes, but I'm pretty sure they've also been done on rowing ergs, and they'll have the athlete do a time trial, and it'll just be the athlete versus themselves, and then on the screen they'll put a couple friends ahead of the athlete. And without fail, you perform better when you're racing against someone else, and particularly if that someone else is a training partner or a friend. Um, and I think that is really like what works for me. So now I'm competing in a meet in a couple of weeks. It'll be like my first big state meet, and I'm trying to cajole everyone and their sister in the gym to also compete, so that it creates that kind of community environment. And then as a lover of language and words, I can't help but remember that the word compete um, comes from the Latin root co, which means with, and then petriere, which means together, to rise up together or to rise up with each other. And I just think like that's such a beautiful way to think about competing. And I think that is now the biggest tool that I'll lean on. But it's hard. I mean, I distinctly remember my coach Zach a year and a half ago when I was going for a PR in the gym. He told me that Zen masters don't make great power lifters, because I just couldn't get up for it, because whether or not I made the lift, I was going to go on and have the rest of my day. And on the one hand, it's a very mature way to not stress and stew about a workout or whether or not you made the lift or not. But on the other hand, it can be a lot harder to tap into that 10 out of 10 effort if you know that whether or not you make the lift, you're whole as a person and you're going to be okay.
I think everything you said there is so fascinating, and as you were speaking, it was making me think. I mean, putting my geeky sports psychologist cap on for a second here, one could go back to the very first, what could be considered the first sports psychology experiment, although it wouldn't have been called that at the time, going back to Norman Triplett's work in 1899 with social facilitation theory. And it's also making me think of, on the Sports Psych show, we've committed quite a few episodes to the theory of challenge and threat states. Professor Mark Jones and others, and they will talk about, to find a challenge state. Initially in their research, there were three contributors to that challenge state: a sense of control, I feel in control; a sense of self-efficacy or confidence, I feel confident; and approach behavior. This is what I want to achieve here. So almost like a sense of having specific objectives. But the fourth one that they've recently introduced from research is social support. So social support can help you tap into a challenge state rather than a threat state. And it's really interesting the way you're using that social support as being, rather than a sense of cooperation, it's a sense of competition between your peers. It's a really interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, I think that's it. And it comes back to how I think of competition,
Yeah.
which is competing to raise each other up. Okay. Versus competing to beat someone or to win. And it's easy for me to say, right? Because I'm not making a living as an athlete. I'm making a living writing books. So I don't have to win. And I know I'm not going to win. Those days are long past. I'm just trying to get the best out of myself and to learn something about myself through the process of mastery in sport. So every time I view competition, it is to help each other get the best out of ourselves. And I do think that you nailed it. That is so helpful for me in going out of an avoidance or a threat mindset into more of a challenge or approach mindset.
That's a really sophisticated lens of competition that I'm seeing it as a way to raise myself up and raise others up as well. And I know you've written a book called The Practice of Groundedness, and I'm assuming that a lot of these what could be considered sophisticated approach, sophisticated relationships or approaches with competitions are a part of that. I mean, I remember seeing a picture of, was it Kipchoge, who the long distance runner, the marathon runner, with the incredible world record. Nice little marketing for you. He held up at the book and said, "I'm reading this at the moment," which is fantastic. I mean, in that book, are these the kind of resources and the tools that you're referring to?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is what I tried to do in that book was explore for myself and explore for my readers a way to redefine success as not just an objective, measurable result, but is the person that you become in the pursuit. While not getting all woo woo and self helpy, acknowledging that results matter. If you are running a business, you need to make payroll and you need to have profit for your investors. If you are a professional athlete, you need to put food on the table by winning races. If you are an author, you need to sell books. So outcomes absolutely matter, but they cannot be the only thing and they cannot be the main thing for too long. So I'm a firm believer that there are times when it is healthy and even helpful to really index on a particular outcome, but that has to be the exception that proves the rule, which is you got to be focused on the process. And the ultimate goal is to become a better person along the way. I think of a recent example here in the States that really just touches my heart is the recent death of the basketball player Bill Walton, who was also a commentator and just an all around personality in the sport, in a really entertaining, kind of awkward, idiosyncratic fella. But when Bill Walton passed away, very few people, myself included, remembered him and were wowed by the fact that he won championships and MVPs both in college and in the pros. But it was Bill Walton, the person, that brought so much joy to people, that had such funny jokes. When I say I want to be more like Bill Walton, it's not about winning championships. It's about bringing that kind of lightheartedness and joy to everything that I do. And no one's going to sit there and remember Bill Walton's championships, and everyone's going to remember Bill Walton, the person. And I think that when we're at our best, we can use our pursuits. We can use sport as a vehicle to become better, more well rounded people. And that's what flourishing is.
Bill Walton, student of John Wooden.
That's right.
Do you feel we share similar philosophies? Do you feel you're constantly pushing at the most aggressive socio-cultural landscape in high performance sport, and maybe high performance in general, but high performance sport, whereby that socio-cultural landscape is very, very obsessed with the narrative around gotta win, gotta win, gotta win, gotta perform, gotta perform, gotta perform, and correlates those kind of extreme approaches, that kind of yearning for victory and the grind and the intensity of performance with victory and with great performances, as opposed to, as I say, your more subtle, more sophisticated narrative around process and person. Do you feel that there's a gale force wind against you?
I do, but I think it's changing.
Okay.
And it's maybe changing ever so slightly. I'll say this, the two people that reach out to me most and come to me for counseling, that buy my books for their teams and their programs and their colleagues, they're athletes who feel this way, but feel like other people don't. And they say, finally, someone has words for what I feel. Like, I feel seen. How can I share this approach with everyone I know? And then the second big category is people that have been absolutely exhausted and burnt out by I call it heroic individualism, by this notion that your entire self-worth comes down to your measurable results. and they're just at the end of the rope. And then they come across my work and they say, all right, maybe there's another way. And what's fascinating, Dan, and you probably know this as well as anyone, is that the research shows that even if all that you cared about was measurable objective results, you'd be better off going the way of a process focused and trying to become a better person than obsessing over results, because obsessing over results tends to put you in a situation where it is very, very hard to sustain performance over the long haul without experiencing anxiety, depression, burnout. We also know that individuals that become too focused on results, it's called obsessive passion, are significantly more likely to dope, engage in performance enhancing illicit drugs, and to put themselves in cultures where that is a significant risk. So I think that whether you approach it from a subjective, I want to feel better, or even an objective, like I want to be the best that I can, I would argue for this process orientation is really a powerful vehicle to get the most out of yourself, and then also to be able to look in the mirror at night and feel like through sport you are becoming the person that you want to be.
Former NBA basketball player, and one of few English former professional basketball players, John Amici, who is now actually a psychologist here in the UK. I remember when The Last Dance came out on Netflix, the Michael Jordan documentary, and he was interviewed, as you'd imagine he would be, being a former NBA professional and now psychologist. And he said, when he was asked about Michael Jordan's behavior, he said, it's just not worth it. It's not, the way he went about it wasn't appropriate, and it wasn't worth it, and it's not worth it. That kind of conduct, that kind of behavior isn't worth it. Now, I don't want to put you too much on the spot. Would you have any comment to that? Would you be in agreement with that? What would you say to that?
I can't know if it's worth it or not because I'm not Michael Jordan. What I can say is that Michael Jordan has a very unique temperament. And for Michael Jordan, playing with a chip on your shoulder and playing with anger and resentment might work. But there are countless other athletes that take a very different approach. So Tim Duncan, greatest power forward ever. There's no documentary on Tim Duncan. Why? Because Tim Duncan is just a normal, regular, nice guy that had fun playing basketball. They called him the big fundamental. He was extremely dedicated to the craft, but without all the psychological baggage that someone like Michael Jordan carried. Now, two very different approaches to greatness. And I think a problem is that the approach that gets all the attention on the airwaves is the Michael Jordan approach because it is a crazy, entertaining story. But there's no documentary on Tim Duncan because it's so boring. And I think it's just important for people to realize that, generally speaking, for every Michael Jordan where that approach works, there's thousands of people that burn out and end up with clinical depression trying to force themselves into that mold when that's not who they are. When perhaps who they are is someone that's more in a Tim Duncan mode. Or a current NBA player, Giannis Antetokounmpo, I think is a great example, who just brings so much joy and fun to the game. And I was having this conversation with a colleague the other day. If you are I'm going to call Michael Jordan a killer, and I obviously don't mean it in the literal sense, but if you are a killer like that, you don't have to try to be a killer. You don't have to pretend. That's just who you are. Trying not to be a killer is hard. I think what happens is you get all these young performers that think they have to be a killer, and then they try to force themselves into that temperament when that's not who they really are. And that's when things can backfire. So I think it is a very individualized thing. And I think, like I said, for every Michael Jordan, there is a Tim Duncan out there, and there's different approaches to Rome. To your original question, is it worth it or not? I mean, I might disagree with Amici. Like, he's the greatest athlete of all time, or at least of a generation. Maybe it was worth it for him. But that's not the only way to achieve greatness.
I think Michael Jordan is really interesting, and I'm passionate about personality science, and I would label his behavior on the court, especially, as instrumental aggression. It's aggression on purpose, and to be able to utilize trash talking in order to change his intensity of feeling on the court and engage in instrumental aggression is a skill and a competence in and of itself, you could potentially say.
And can I say one more thing about Michael Jordan? The other interesting thing is he won his championships with Phil Jackson as a coach.
Yeah,
And Phil Jackson is the Zen master,
yeah, I was going to say that.
mindfulness, peace,
Yeah.
love, and compassion. And I think Phil Jackson is a really important counterbalance to Michael Jordan. And I'm not sure that if Michael Jordan didn't have Phil Jackson, he wouldn't have blown up. And the same thing is true with Kobe Bryant, another kind of killer, aggressive, instrumental aggression athlete. Who was his coach when he won his championships? Phil Jackson. So I think that there's also just a lot of like fortuitous luck and timing. And maybe there's a lesson there where if you are wired like a Michael Jordan, it's so important to surround yourself with people that can offset that just enough so it doesn't blow up in your face.
Well, this is a really interesting conversation because it speaks to the complexity of human beings and the makeup of teams. And I think there's a juxtaposition here because listening to you, and as I say, and I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking with you, I would, in my consultancy practice, I tend towards, and very many sports psychs do nowadays, tend towards that philosophy of process and person, process and person. Similarly, and this is the juxtaposition, we're speaking to individual differences and that there are going to be outliers. Some of them were on that Chicago team. Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, whom Phil Jackson had to accommodate. Equally, you've got those kind of players who you might deem to be not the most coachable and not the most coach friendly, and yet we've got so many memes on social media platforms and so much advice around be coachable, be coachable, be coachable. So much advice. So there's this interesting world right now in high performance sport where you've got you and me saying process and person. You've got these uber talented individuals who bring the aggression or bring the idiosyncrasies to the game. And then you've got lots of motivational gurus and college coaches talking about be coachable. And it's like, where's this sweet spot here? And also, I suppose where I'm going here is if you were involved with an NFL team, are you and the coach is having a conversation with you about a player who's a little bit of an outlier, and yet you have this working philosophy of process and person, where are you going with that? Are you saying to the coach, hey, we've got to keep this person on the team? You've written a book, Master of Change. Do we try to change this person? Where do we go here, Brad?
I think that you take that person's unique temperament and personality, and then you try to protect that person from their potential kryptonite. So what is the potential kryptonite? It's when that personality can run unrestrained. An example of that in sport is Lance Armstrong. So you asked me if Michael Jordan, if it was worth it, and I said I don't know, maybe, even probably. Lance Armstrong, no way, because he cheated, he engaged in unethical behavior, and I think that is what can happen when you get an obsessive win at all costs personality like that without appropriate constraints, is that all costs really becomes all costs. So it's a disjointed way of answering your question, which is I think I go to that coach or I go to that player and I say, like, this is what you bring, this is your personality, this is your temperament. Now, how can we make sure that it doesn't blow up on you? How can we make sure that you milk it all the way to the line where it's going to work positively for you, but it doesn't lead to overtraining? It doesn't lead to throwing punches at teammates. It doesn't lead to the temptation of performance enhancing drugs. So I would never try to take someone that's wired like that and turn them into a, Zen master of sport, but I would make sure that I'm looking the other way just enough so that they don't derail themselves.
I love that because as a sports psychologist, the way I translate that as somebody again who's interested in personality science is that what you're saying is you create an environment around a human being who's in your team, who is a player, who is a performer, and you make sure that environment doesn't allow them to go to the end of their personality traits. As in, for instance, the end of conscientiousness would be having a perfectionist tendency too often. The end of neuroticism would be the violent side of things. The end of low agreeableness would just be I'm not interested in being coached at all. So I love what you're saying. You're trying to create an environment with rules and guidelines and values that enable coaches to keep players probably more towards the middle of those personality traits.
That's right, and I think that then you get the opposite, which is maybe someone that's, like, really high on openness to new experiences, and that person is just, like, having a lot of fun and, who cares about winning? I'm learning, I'm growing. In elite or professional level, well, winning matters. So then you've got to move that person a little bit more towards conscientiousness and neuroticism to get the best out of them. But I don't believe in a coach trying to change someone's personality on the field to make them a better performer. I believe with, I believe in identifying what drives someone and then making sure that that is not taken to such an extreme that it backfires. Dan, still teaching and coaching towards person and process, because even Michael Jordan now in that documentary, like at the end of the day, I mean, the most competitive athlete of a generation, the fiercest, the person that is truly a win at all cost type of athlete, he still spent a lot of time joking about his teammates. And I think as Michael Jordan ages and gets older, the focus will be more on the teammates, and more on the community along the way. And I think it's just helpful to remind athletes of that, that like the so much of the, it sounds so freaking cliche, but so much of the reward is the journey in the relationships that you forge. Again, we have very empirical research for this. We know that when individuals are towards the end of their lives and they're asked to reflect back on their careers, rarely do they talk about objective results. They don't talk about the gold medal or the championship or how good it felt to get the promotion. They talk about the people that were involved with them on those climbs, the teammates, the coaches, the competitors. That's the stuff that we really remember. And I think the more that we can index on that when we're in the thick of things, the more that we enjoy the really hard work. Because being great and greatness is going to be extremely hard. There's no way around it. There are going to be sacrifices and trade offs and periods of exhaustion and fatigue. But if we can focus on process, person, and community, then maybe we enjoy that hard work more. And I'm a firm believer that if we enjoy the hard work more, it becomes more sustainable.
So I'd like to come back to something you said earlier when we first introduced your book, The Practice of Groundedness. You whether it was an offhand comment, I don't know, but you initially said you wrote it for yourself. Is you're writing for yourself more than anything else?
I would say that I cannot start a book unless I'm genuinely curious to explore. So I'd rather not write a book where I feel like I have a pretty good sense of the answer, because it's just not as fun. I would rather write a book where I have a really burning question and I have a hypothesis, but then I want to go do the research and reporting to try to figure out the answer. And by writing the book, I am writing it for myself. So the question in the practice of groundedness is, what would it look like, again, to win and to care about winning, but to do it in a way where more of the emphasis is shifted on the process? Because again, when I wrote that book, I found that there's like these two extremes. And the one extreme is the winning is everything. And then the other extreme is let's all hold hands and sing kumbaya and all that matters is the process. But anyone that's ever been around high performance knows that like you kind of have to exist in the middle, because you do want to perform well and winning does beat losing. But if it becomes the sole predominant focus, we just see that rates of burnout are so high. So that book is like really around trying to develop a vocabulary and a framework for winning without losing your soul, or for the broader public, achieving success without sacrificing fulfillment. And it's something that I myself is trying to do. I'm trying to be the best writer in the country, in the world, whatever, high aspiration on this topic. So I'm trying to win, but I also am trying to do it in a way where it's fun, where it's fulfilling, where I experience joy, where I don't start becoming bitter and having resentment. So that book is very much for myself in that way too.
Well, let's pause on that and let's dig into that a little bit. Because again, we're working along continuums here, and I have a little bit of a thesis that as human beings, and I suppose it's drawn from cognitive behavioural therapy, we do have a tendency as human beings to see things in all or nothing or black and white. So we do love to exist on the ends of the continuums. Got to win, got to win, got to win. Or I think as you said earlier, you can go too much the other way, and it's finding that balance. I mean, within the book, what and in your own consultancy practice, how are you helping people to find that middle ground? I mean, I think borrowing from my own consultancy practice, whether it's helping people create a linkage, a narrative from, well, I'd like to win, so perhaps we're rationalizing things a little bit more. I'd like rather than I must. How am I going to do that? Let's focus on the process, and then broadening out the process. Where do you go in the book to help people find that sacred middle ground?
Yeah, I think that a lot of this comes down to the value of being present.
Okay.
For those that maybe don't love the language of mindfulness, like digging where your feet are,
Yep.
I love that little expression because I think that a lot of our getting too caught up in results comes from being ahead of ourselves and wondering what could happen if we win or what could happen if we lose, or looking back and reflecting on past victories and trying to recreate them or dwelling on past failures. Whereas if we can dig where our feet are and be where we are, a lot of that takes care of itself. Um, Particularly for a sports person, those moments of flow and kind of loss of ego and self consciousness generally come from intense focus on the moment. And I think that there are acute episodes of flow when you're in a competition or you're in a training session and you lose yourself. And that has been very well documented and studied by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and colleagues, and is really a cornerstone of sports performance psychology. I think what's more interesting right now for me is what I would call a longer term period of flow, where maybe it's not just in a workout or a competition, but it's
Yep.
a 6-month training cycle where you're just kind of in a groove. And what I find is when people hit that groove, they're not thinking about the competition that's ahead. They are just where they are in the training. And I think that if we can be present in the moment, I mean, listen, and there's a reason that this notion of mindfulness or presence, it's in Eastern and Western philosophical traditions, contemplative traditions. So it has been selected for throughout cultural evolution. And I think in a performance setting, it really helps ground us, to use the title of the book, in the moment. Um, and I think that is the most important thing. And then I'd say the second most important thing is the people that you put around you. Um, I increasingly believe that we over index on our own values and our own ethical moral systems and under index on how affected we are by the people around us. In a sporting context at an elite level, nobody thinks that they're going to engage in cheating, in performance enhancing drugs and in doping and so on and so forth. And you look at stories of athletes who cheat, and it's always within a system. There are very, very rarely lone wolf dopers. And then you look at athletes who have long careers and do it the right way, and they're always within a system. And I think as a young athlete, or maybe a veteran athlete, it doesn't matter. If you find this conversation valuable and resonant, I would really ask yourself, am I surrounding myself with people, with coaches, with colleagues, with psychologists, with other athletes? Even if you're just a hobby jogger on the weekend, am I in a track club where people are espousing a similar value system? And that also helps a lot because then day in and day out, you're working within that framework where you're not feeling like, oh, I'm going about it wrong. So I think that it is digging where your feet are, and then it is surrounding yourself with people that espouse a similar value system. And the result of those two things, of presence and community, really leads to a lot of fulfillment. And I believe the most sustainable form of peak performance. And those are two of like the five core principles of groundedness, right? Our presence in community. The others being patience, vulnerability, and acceptance. And I'd put those in a close third, fourth, and fifth place to presence and community.
I'd be keen to get on to those three. Again, I'm using the term juxtaposition far too much, but again, it's an interesting you've juxtaposed the individual versus the psychosocial, I suppose, the social environment. The individual being uh, whether it's play where your feet are or be where your feet are, that sense of mindfulness, the mind wanders, but just being in tune with that, and at the same time building the social support network around you, and the combination of those two can help you immerse yourself in the process by the sounds of it. It would be wonderful for the last few minutes, 5-10 minutes, if we could close out and talk about patience, vulnerability, and acceptance. They sound like three things when I was a professional golfer that they weren't my strongest skills, Brad. So I'd love to have a conversation with you about those. Talk to me a little bit about patience.
All right. So patience is just really doing everything possible to play the long game and to realize that oftentimes what we think we'll accomplish in a year or two might take a decade.
Yep.
And so often when we artificially constrain ourselves on a too short time scale, we burn out, we overtrain, physically or psychologically, we become injured. Whereas if we give ourselves the time and space to really evolve and improve without feeling rushed, again, we enjoy it more and we give ourselves the best chance of success. So I think that too often we think in 1 or 2 years instead of 9 or 10 years.
And that, if I may interject, I've got a little story on this, but if I briefly interject,
Yeah.
it makes such a difference to your capacity to balance that sense of relaxation and intensity, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Because if you feel like this is it, I've got 2 weeks or 2 years or whatever the arbitrary timeline is, then you might start taking risks that don't make sense. Whereas if you've got 10 years, well, then you don't feel the same amount of pressure day in and day out, which then allows you to be more consistent over time. Now, again, there's no absolutes. If you're in a 4-year Olympic cycle and you're 32 years old and this might be your last go, and you're in the final build with 8 months out from training, and you know the marks in your sport, is that a time to take risks? Probably, if I'm being honest. But if you're a 22-year-old, I would say no. I would say you've got to be patient. And I think that our default is to compressing time, and then we get in our own way because, again, we take unacceptable risk. Or forget physical injury, mental injury and illness. We just become so anxious about needing to make it happen immediately. And and this is so freaking hard. I am constantly reminding myself that, hey, like I might not have sold 1 million books or whatever it is that I look to other people, but I haven't been doing it for 30 years. So I get it, because like I have to practice what I preach and to play that long game. And all these principles are related, Dan, because when I have those feelings of rush, I'm not in the present moment. I'm thinking about my result, or I'm thinking about what other people are doing or what other authors are doing. Whereas when I'm deep in a book project and I am in the present moment, I could care less about book sales. I'm not thinking about, oh, how did I do in the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? I'm just in the moment doing the actual work. So the more that we can be in the moment doing the work, the more that we're patient, the more that we can adopt a mindset that allows us to play the long game, the more we can settle into the moment and do the work.
It's interesting, Brad, if I can just tell you a little story here. A decade ago, when I was lead psychologist for England Golf, our technical director was also the captain of the Walker Cup golf team. And the Walker Cup team is the amateur Ryder Cup event, although it's the US versus Great Britain and Ireland. It's a historical event. And the technical director, when he came back to England Golf and he was talking to us all, coaches and players, and we were just having a conversation with him about his experiences, he said he had spent a bit of time with Bryson DeChambeau. Very topical right now because as we speak, Bryson DeChambeau has just won the US Open golf tournament. And he was talking to Bryson DeChambeau and he said, what do you feel is some of the differences between the American players and our players in Great Britain? And Bryson DeChambeau said, well, one of the things I've noticed is that we're much more patient over here. We go to college. That 4 years of college really helped me to mature. I had a much more holistic education as a consequence of it. And we started to have a bit of a problem in the world of golf over here, or at least my perception. We had a problem with the emergence of Tiger Woods because the emergence of this absolute genius meant that every young player playing the game wanted to be world number one by the time they were 19, 20, 21 years old. And they thought that that was the pathway to do it. And so rather than, say, going to college or giving themselves some time to get good at the game, a little bit of emotional maturity as well, which you build at that stage of life, they were just, they left school at 16. They would be playing full-time golf at 16, 17 years old. And it, to me, it had such a detrimental effect to the games and the lives of those young people. So not formulating a question, but just reflecting back a story to you.
In the temptation is there, and I'll reflect a story back to you just to show how much the temptation is there, and how hard it is to sometimes practice these principles. So my son is 6 years old, and he has a temperament just like his dad, where he finds things that he is interested in and then he goes all in. So my 6-year-old son right now, there's two things that he's interested in: basketball and chess. And if it were up to him, his entire life would be basketball and chess, playing, watching, studying, so on and so forth. And I take him to this chess club, and it's a bunch of older people in my 6-year-old. And there's such a temptation to push him now because he's good at chess. And the older people then reinforce that by being like, oh, he's so good, he should play more chess, this, that, the other. And it takes so much restraint and skill on my part as the parent to say, actually, we're not going to do 3 times a week private lessons because he needs to have a childhood, because that's what's going to be best for him in the long term. And I do not judge parents that over specialize their kids or that rush that process, that aren't patient, that in your story are the 16-year-olds coming out of school, because there's so much pressure. And I firmly believe all parents want is what's best for their kids. And in the moment, it feels best for your kid to push, push, push. But when you zoom out and you look at the literature, it is so clear that being patient, not rushing that process, helping people develop more holistically as young adults and human beings leads to better performance. But it's hard. And I think that if we think that it's just going to become natural for us to do that, we're lying to ourselves and we're going to run into traps. I think the best that we can hope for is to be aware of these biases, to spot them when they come up, and then to restrain ourselves from making mistakes, whether that's as coaches, as mentors, as parents, as psychologists, as other practitioners.
Just as you're speaking there, the chess reminded me of the Polgar sisters. Have you heard of the Polgar sisters, who had a father who...
Oh, yes, I have.
Was a psychologist and was convinced that geniuses are made, not born. So
Yep.
he used essentially his 3 children as mini
Experiments.
experiments. And one of them became one of the greatest chess players of all time, but 2 didn't, and who knows what the repercussions can be, and that is very much a case study of one. So I appreciate everything you've said there. Listen, I want to be really, really respectful of your time, but what a fascinating conversation, and I can't thank you enough, and thank you for all your great work and the books that you've written. I love Peak Performance, by the way. I know you wrote that with Steve, and love the concept of stress and rest, and in my own consultancy practice, I know that I don't think there's anything more important than stress and rest for athletes, really. So brilliant. And I know you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in contact?
So I am so appreciative of the conversation. The feelings are run both ways. So thank you first and foremost. The best way to find me is my website, which is just my name, www.bradstulberg.com. And then the two other places I am on the internet are Instagram, where I am at Brad Stulberg, and then Twitter, although slightly less than I once was, I am at B Stulberg. So that is the best place to learn more.
Fantastic. Brad, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.